Nobody noticed at first because it didn't seem like much, just another lost link in an old forum, buried among complaints about platforms promising easy money and ads disguised as miraculous opportunities. The title was too simple to attract attention. AI Task Interface. Weekly payments in USD, no emojis, no exaggerated promises, no screenshots of absurd earnings. Ethan Moore clicked out of sheer boredom. At 32, he lived in Columbus, Ohio, in an apartment that was too functional to be comfortable and too quiet to be inspiring. He worked remotely for a technical support company that outsourced services to Silicon Valley startups. It wasn't a bad job, but it was predictable, mechanical, and fragile. Every week there was a new rumor about layoffs, automation, silent replacements. Ethan felt he was always 2 clicks away from being irrelevant. That night, as winter pressed against the windows with a dry, constant wind, he drifted aimlessly, hopping from window to window, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling of stagnation. The link opened a minimalist page, white background, neutral font, a simple panel with few instructions, evaluation of responses generated by language models, data correction, context validation, payment in US dollars via international transfer, no motivational videos, no inspiring stories, just one button, apply. Ethan closed the tab. He reopened it. He read it again. The text wasn't trying to convince him of anything, and that bothered him more than any exaggerated promise. On the other side of that system was Lena Whitaker, though Ethan didn't know it yet. Lena didn't appear in videos, didn't give interviews, and didn't have an active social media profile. To the public, she practically didn't exist. Within certain technical circles, however, her name was associated with projects that emerged quietly, grew rapidly, and disappeared from the radar before they attracted too much attention. Lena had spent the last decade working with data, language, and automation. She had seen companies fail because of excessive noise and unrealistic promises. She had learned that in the digital ecosystem, those who solved real problems without seeking applause survived. Her current project didn't sell dreams, it bought human precision. The irony did not escape her notice. The platform was created for a specific purpose: to improve artificial intelligence systems with fairly paid human supervision. No voluntary training, no gamification, no disguised exploitation. Real people correcting, evaluating, and refining. Real payment, in dollars. Everything documented, legal but intentionally discreet. The conflict was not within the system itself, but in the silence surrounding it. Ethan filled out the form that same night. No traditional resume, just practical questions, interpretation tests, ambiguous scenarios. He noticed something strange. The questions weren't looking for right answers, but for coherence, clarity, and judgment. It wasn't a test of speed, but of attention. 3 days later, a short email arrived. No flashy signature, just access instructions. Upon first logging in, Ethan understood why almost no one was talking about it. There was no public ranking. There were no testimonials. There was no incentive to invite friends. The dashboard displayed objective tasks, clear hourly rates, and a transparent payment history. He completed his first task in 20 minutes. The next day, another. Within a week, he received notification of the international transfer. The amount wouldn't change his life, but it was real, predictable, and growing according to the quality of his work. Meanwhile, Lena observed quiet metrics: retention rate, average quality of reviews, geographic distribution of employees. The project grew without fanfare, sustained by people like Ethan, ordinary, attentive professionals, underestimated by the traditional market. The antagonism had no immediate face. It wasn't a specific person, but a larger system. The attention economy, the empty promises, the constant noise that made legitimate opportunities invisible. Platforms that depended on people's lack of knowledge about how money actually circulated on the internet. Ethan began to notice something that unsettled him. Whenever he casually mentioned that he was earning dollars with online tasks, the reactions were predictable. Disbelief, irony, jokes about scams. He stopped commenting. He realized the system seemed to work better in silence. The mystery was not with. That was real. It was because something so functional, transparent, and simple wasn't available everywhere. And most importantly, how long would it take before someone tried to distort, copy, or destroy it? Winter continued outside. Inside the apartment, Ethan closed his laptop with a new feeling, not of euphoria, but of concrete possibility. Something was changing, even if almost no one was looking. The platform's dashboard became an almost disconcertingly natural part of Ethan's routine. There were no insistent notifications or artificial goals. Tasks appeared in organized blocks, each accompanied by a brief description, estimated average time, and clearly defined dollar value. Nothing was inflated. Nothing was hidden. He started by performing simple tasks, evaluating model-generated responses to everyday questions, identifying factual inconsistencies, and flagging dangerous ambiguities. The system didn't require deep technical knowledge, but it punished carelessness. One wrong click, a superficial assessment, and the reliability score dropped. When that happened, access to better-paying tasks decreased. The very functioning of the platform taught Ethan something he had never learned in courses or motivational videos. In the real digital economy, measurable reliability is worth more than speed. As the weeks went by, new categories of tasks opened up, reviewing financial texts, evaluating non-clinical medical responses, providing cultural context for regional American expressions. Each new layer demanded more attention and offered better pay. There were no shortcuts. Growth came from consistency. Off-screen, Ethan's life was beginning to change in small details. He reorganized his work schedule at his main job, negotiating fewer hours and more flexibility. He didn't tell his manager the real reason. He only said he was getting involved in side projects. The reaction was lukewarm, almost indifferent, which confirmed an uncomfortable suspicion. His formal job was less indispensable than he had imagined. The United States Ethan lived in wasn't the one portrayed in advertisements. It was a country where millions of people worked online without fully understanding how money circulated. Freelancers competed on saturated platforms, accepting increasingly lower pay. Content creators were dependent on unstable algorithms. Constant promises of financial freedom were fueled by aggressive advertising and rare results. Lena's platform operated in opposition to all of that. It didn't compete for attention. It didn't depend on going viral. It functioned as a silent contract between people and systems. Lena, for her part, monitored everything from a discreet office in Seattle. The space was functional, almost clinical. Screens displayed graphs that wouldn't impress ordinary investors, stable lines, gradual growth, low turnover. For her, that was the true sign of success. His journey hadn't been romantic. It stemmed from failed projects, startups swallowed up by larger competitors, good ideas destroyed by aggressive monetization. He had learned early on that the greatest risk wasn't a lack of money, but premature exposure. The current project stemmed from a simple observation. AI models were being trained with noisy, biased, or poorly evaluated data, while skilled people were being discarded or underpaid. The imbalance was evident. The solution seemed obvious, and precisely for that reason dangerous for those profiting from the chaos. Lena structured the platform to be deliberately boring at first glance. No flashy design, no heroic narrative, just efficiency. She knew this would filter out two types of people: superficial, curious individuals and attentive professionals. Only the latter stayed. Among the contributors, recurring profiles began to emerge. There was Maria, a retired teacher from New Mexico who supplemented her income by evaluating educational content. Jason, a former journalist from Chicago who had found a way to monetize his critical thinking without depending on unstable newsrooms. And there was Ethan, still invisible to Lena as an individual, but statistically notable for his consistency. The platform didn't encourage interaction between users, but small patterns emerged, similar schedules, preferred types of tasks, evaluation styles. For Lena, each collaborator was a vector of quality. For the collaborators, the platform was a rare source of predictability in a volatile market. Ethan began to see something beyond the money. The tasks forced him to think more carefully, write more clearly, and question answers he would have previously accepted automatically. He began to apply this rigor to other areas: contracts, news, online promises. He became more skeptical and more competent. When the second payment in dollars arrived in his international account, without delays or hidden fees, he felt something close to respect. Not for the amount, but for the process. This wasn't a hack. It was real work, mediated by technology. The antagonism began to take shape indirectly. In larger forums, vague comments emerged about strange platforms that pay too well. In freelancer groups, reports were quickly discredited or labeled as disguised advertising. Influencers ignored the issue. There were no affiliates, no trackable links, no commissions. Silence remained the system's greatest protection. Lena knew this wouldn't last forever. As the models improved and results came in, companies would start asking, and when asked, someone would try to reply, by not paying people, or by paying less, or by exploiting human labor under another name. She had already been preparing for this, adjusting contracts, strengthening the internal architecture, creating validation layers that were difficult to copy. The tech world didn't forgive naivete. Ethan, oblivious to these strategic decisions, only sensed that something unusual was happening. For the first time, he was participating in an online system that didn't seem designed to wear him down. There were no hidden tricks, just hard work being directly rewarded. The question that was beginning to form in his mind was no longer, is this real, but why isn't this taught? And that question, if asked too loudly, could change everything. The first sign that something was going wrong didn't come from the platform, but from the world around it. Ethan noticed it one ordinary Tuesday morning, while absent-mindedly scrolling through his news feed before starting his day's tasks. A short article, lost among more eye-catching headlines, mentioned that large technology companies were facing difficulties maintaining the quality of their artificial intelligence models due to a shortage of specialized human oversight. The text didn't name names, it didn't offer solutions, but Ethan felt an immediate unease. He was part of that oversight, even if no one seemed to acknowledge it publicly. On the platform, the tasks began to change in tone. They were no longer just one-off assessments. Now, they required comparison between similar answers, identification of ethical subtleties, and marking of legal risks. The average time increased. Compensation followed suit, but in a precise, almost surgical way. Nothing seemed improvised. This refinement brought tension. A mistake carried more weight. A superficial judgment could block access to entire categories. Ethan began to review each decision twice. The concentration required drained energy, but it also revealed something important. This work had a real impact. Meanwhile, Lena was dealing with pressures that weren't showing up on the dashboards. One of her corporate partners, an intermediary that licensed trained models, had started asking too many questions. He wanted to know how the data was validated, how many people were involved, where they were located. Legitimate questions, but asked with an interest that went beyond mere technical curiosity. Lena answered only what was necessary, always what was necessary. Enough to keep contracts active, but not to reveal the inner workings of the system. Experience had taught her that excessive transparency at the wrong time was an elegant form of corporate suicide. The conflict intensified when sensitive tasks began to appear, evaluations of responses related to personal finances, basic investments, career decisions. Ethan realized he was helping to shape how future AIs would guide real people. This went beyond simply correcting text. There was responsibility involved. He refused some tasks. The platform allowed this without direct penalty, but the gesture was recorded. Each choice created a profile. Ethan was beginning to understand that he wasn't just being evaluated on performance, but on the type of judgment he exercised. In the outside world, the noise grew. Imitative platforms emerged, promising quick profits with AI training. Ethan recognized the pattern: flashy interfaces, referral bonuses, opaque payments. Some people in the forums began to confuse these initiatives with the real platform. Skepticism increased. The terrain became more hostile. Lena observed everything with calculated coldness. She knew that the greatest risk came not from direct competition, but from the dilution of the idea. When everything seems like a scam, even what is legitimate suffers. Her dilemma was clear: remain invisible and safe, or grow and become a target. An internal meeting sealed the next move. The system would require more complex cross-validations, further reducing the possibility of exploitation. This would make access more difficult and growth slower. Some employees would leave the process, others would excel. Ethan felt the impact immediately. An assignment returned with a grade of insufficient appeared in his record, accompanied by a short, impersonal technical justification. He partially disagreed, but there was no room for emotional argument, only data. He adjusted the method, changed the approach, raised the bar. The conflict was now internal as well. Continuing required more effort, more attention, more responsibility, all without public recognition, without status, without a heroic narrative, just results. At the same time, his dependence on traditional employment was decreasing. Dollar pay had become a significant part of his monthly income. Not enough to quit everything, but enough to reveal an alternative. And alternatives are dangerous for systems that depend on conformity. An unexpected email arrived one night. It wasn't from the platform, it was from the company where Ethan formerly worked. A strategic restructuring, staff reduction. His position was among those impacted. No drama, no clear villains, just corporate efficiency. Ethan closed the email and opened the platform's dashboard. There were tasks available, real work, clear payment. For the first time, the line between the old world and the new had completely broken down. On the other hand, Lena received a different notification. A major player in the sector had expressed interest in a strategic partnership with vague terms and a clear appetite for control. The kind of proposal that, if accepted, would change everything, and not for the better. The central conflict was set: grow and compromise principles, or remain small and vulnerable. For Ethan, the question was simpler and harder: trust an invisible system or return to a market that had just discarded him. Neither of them knew it yet, but their next decisions would put them on a collision course with forces far greater than they could have imagined. The loss of his formal job didn't lead Ethan to immediate despair. The shock came in a different, quieter way. In the following days, he realized how much time and energy had been consumed by a structure that, at the critical moment, had offered no resistance whatsoever to support him. The platform, by contrast, remained stable, indifferent to external turbulence. With more time available, Ethan began accepting longer and more complex tasks. Some required extensive comparative analyses, others involved verifying answers about basic legislation, always with clear warnings about ethical limits. Each task came with a history of previous versions, allowing him to see how models erred, partially corrected themselves, and sometimes repeated old mistakes. This revealed an invisible subplot. the constant struggle between automation and real understanding. Meanwhile, Ethan began applying what he was learning outside the platform. He created simple spreadsheets to track income, converted payments to dollars with lower fees, and opened an international digital account that he had previously ignored because he thought it was too complicated. Without realizing it, he was learning, not through tutorials, but out of practical necessity, how money circulated on the global internet. Another subplot emerged unexpectedly when Jason, the former journalist, sent a private message through a restricted internal channel created solely for collaborative tasks. This was unusual, but permitted in specific cases. Jason wanted to confirm a cultural interpretation in an assignment involving ambiguous language used in past political campaigns. The exchange was objective, technical, almost cold. Even so, it opened a crack. Other collaborators began to recognize each other indirectly, not by names, but by analytical patterns. Small centers of expertise emerged and dissolved as tasks demanded, without creating noisy communities. It was collaboration without public identity, something rare in the digital environment. Meanwhile, Lena was dealing with her own subplot, legal pressure. Outside lawyers began recommending preventative adjustments. The growth, though controlled, was already attracting regulatory attention. International payments, remote work, employee classification, everything needed to be solid to withstand future challenges. She reviewed contracts, adjusted terms, and reinforced the distinction between employment and service provision. Every decision had consequences. Making the system more robust meant making it less accessible to beginners. The funnel narrowed. This decision resonated with Ethan. New tests appeared. Additional barriers were put in place before accessing premium tasks. Some longtime collaborators disappeared from the dashboard. The platform didn't announce anything, it just changed. A more delicate subplot emerged when tasks related to sensitive content began to appear. Answers about mental health, high-risk financial decisions, personal conflicts. There were always clear warnings not to offer direct advice, only to evaluate the quality of the AI-generated answers. Even so, Ethan felt the weight of responsibility. A mistake there wasn't just technical, it could affect real people. Time pressure increased. Some tasks had short windows of availability, requiring quick decisions. The pace accelerated without losing precision. The tension came not from artificial deadlines, but from the awareness of impact. In the background, the digital market was buzzing. Viral videos promised absurd earnings with AI working for you. Influencers sold courses that taught how to exploit systems that didn't exist or were already saturated. Ethan observed everything with critical distance. He now knew the difference between noise and infrastructure. One night, while reviewing a particularly complex task, Ethan noticed a strange pattern. Certain incorrect answers were repeated with slight variations, as if someone were trying to force a specific bias into the models. He noted the behavior, following protocol, without further comment. Lena received the alert hours later. It confirmed a long-held suspicion. There were external attempts to manipulate AI systems from the ground up. It wasn't a direct attack, but a slow infiltration, using human labor as a vector. This discovery connected all the subplots, the need for secrecy, the narrower funnel, the legal pressure. Everything pointed to the same risk. If the system became too public, it would be exploited, corrupted, or dismantled. Ethan, unknowingly, had contributed to a larger strategic decision. Lena adjusted detection algorithms, reinforced cross-checking layers, and further reduced external exposure. The cost was immediate. Fewer tasks available, more demands, more silence. But the structure has strengthened. The question that lingered now was no longer about money, but about sustainability. How long could such a system survive in an environment that rewarded noise and penalized discretion? The answer was slowly taking shape through the actions of people who would never appear on magazine covers. The tipping point didn't arrive with fanfare. There was no widespread failure, data leak, or scandalous headline. It came in the form of a silent update to the dashboard, too small for most to notice, too significant for those who were paying attention. Ethan noticed it when he accessed the platform on a grey Thursday morning. A new warning occupied the top of the screen, written in the same neutral tone as always. Some tasks will require advanced reliability verification. Access will only be granted to selected collaborators. Just below, a button that was previously inaccessible was now active. He clicked. The system requested additional validation. It wasn't a typical technical test, but a sequence of ethically ambiguous scenarios. Wrong answers weren't marked as incorrect, only as inconsistent. Each choice subtly altered the next step. There was no going back. Ethan took over an hour to complete it. When he finished, no approval message appeared. Just a return to the main panel, now with a new category unlocked. The tasks there were unlike anything he had ever seen before. It was no longer a matter of evaluating isolated responses, but decision chains. He needed to analyze how one initial response led to another, and how small deviations could culminate in dangerous advice, reinforced biases, or manipulable interpretations. It was there that the decision was made whether an AI would help someone grow or get lost. The weight of the responsibility quickly became clear. Each task had fewer instructions, less margin for error, and proportionally higher pay. It wasn't purely financial incentive, it was a filter. While Ethan was working, Lena was facing her own dilemma. The proposal that had arrived days earlier was now formalized. A large technology company offered investment, infrastructure, and global reach. In exchange, it demanded access to its internal human validation processes. The argument was elegant: scale, efficiency, global impact. Lena read the contract with surgical precision. Among the well-written clauses, she saw what was really at stake. Their model didn't want to improve AI, it wanted to internalize human judgment, dilute it, make it invisible and cheap again. Accepting would mean explosive growth and a complete loss of control. Refusing meant remaining small, pressured, vulnerable to copies and indirect attacks. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, he activated the plan he had been developing for months, the irreversible segmentation of the system. From that moment on, only a fraction of the employees would have access to the critical layers. The rest would continue to perform legitimate tasks, but isolated from the core. Ethan was now inside this core group, without knowing exactly what that meant. The revelation came indirectly. One of the tasks presented a realistic case. A hypothetical user seeking financial guidance after losing their job. The AI's response seemed correct at first glance, but it carried a subtle bias, pushing risky decisions under the guise of autonomy. Ethan flagged the problem, detailed the risk, and suggested adjustments. Upon submitting, an unprecedented notification appeared. This assessment will be used as a reference. He stopped. He read it again. That had never happened before. On the same day, the volume of tasks decreased drastically. The dashboard was almost empty. Entire groups of collaborators were automatically demoted or removed from advanced access. The platform seemed to shrink before the eyes of those who were inside. Behind the scenes, Lena had made the decision. She refused the offer. No announcement, no public statement, just a short email thanking them for their interest and ending the negotiations. I knew the consequences would come, and quickly. And it came. 2 days later, news emerged about a new open initiative for human AI training, promoted by well-known companies. They promised payments, flexibility, and social impact. The difference was in the details. Vague values, confusing terms, and a complete transfer of rights. Noise filled the space that was once silent. Ethan recognized the pattern immediately. People would confuse everything. What was solid would blend in with what was predatory. The real platform would become just another name amidst the noise, if it survived. The personal turning point came that same week when Ethan received a payment larger than any he had received before. It wasn't a bonus, it was direct compensation for critical tasks. The money confirmed something he already suspected. He now depended more on the platform than it depended on him. That scared him. He realized he wasn't just making money online. He was participating in an invisible infrastructure that would shape the future decisions of millions of people, without credit, without a stage, without a guarantee of permanence. Lena also felt the weight of the choice. Her charts didn't celebrate growth. They showed tense stability, a fortified castle before the siege. They had both crossed a line. There was no going back to the previous state. From that moment on, the system could no longer be merely discrete. It would have to resist, and those who were inside would need to decide how far they were willing to go. The consequences of Lena's decision didn't manifest immediately, but spread like slow waves, difficult to contain and impossible to ignore. The digital ecosystem reacted first with confusion, then with noise, and finally with appropriation. Terms like human oversight, ethical AI training, and fair pay began appearing on sales pages, short videos, and sponsored ads. The problem wasn't the popularization of the ideas, it was their distortion. Ethan observed everything with a mixture of detachment and unease. Inside the platform, the silence had deepened. Fewer tasks, more complex. No explanation, just the bare, demanding work without emotional reinforcement. The system now selected not only those who knew how to evaluate, but those who could tolerate the absence of external validation. The first practical reaction came from Ethan's own daily life. His monthly income had become irregular. Some days were very profitable, others almost nothing. The previous predictability had disappeared. The money continued to arrive in dollars, but at less consistent intervals. This forced him to make concrete decisions, reduce expenses, renegotiate services, and accept instability as part of the process. He realized he was learning a lesson that almost no one taught about making money online. Scale is not synonymous with stability. Small infrastructure can pay well, but it demands resilience. Meanwhile, some employees began to disappear silently. No warning, no public drama, just absence. The platform didn't explain the terminations, but the pattern was clear. Those who prioritized volume over quality were dropped. Those who treated the system as a shortcut lost access. Lena, for her part, was dealing with more direct external reactions. Long-standing partners reduced contracts. Intermediaries withdrew. The implicit message was clear. Without aggressive growth, the project became less attractive to those thinking about rapid scaling. Internally, she reinforced the minimum staff, adjusted costs, and accepted an uncomfortable truth. The project would now survive on technical merit, not hype. It was a calculated but real risk. Emotional reactions also intensified. For the first time, Ethan felt afraid of depending too much on something he didn't control. At the same time, he realized that the traditional job market no longer welcomed him easily. Applications he sent received automatic responses or silence. The visible economy seemed saturated, the invisible one selective. An unexpected consequence arose when Ethan began helping people close to him, not with promises, but with practical guidance. He explained how to open international accounts, how to avoid platforms that paid in points, and how to be wary of exaggerated earnings. He didn't mention the platform directly. He only taught criteria. Some listened, others ignored. Most preferred to believe in shortcuts. Lena received reports confirming something worrying. Reverse engineering attempts were increasing. People were trying to map out how the system worked using publicly available tasks, creating simplified versions to exploit cheap labor. The project was beginning to be copied. without understanding, without ethics, without fair compensation. The reaction was immediate: more layers of isolation, less external transparency, more internal focus. The system closed itself off as a defense mechanism. This came at a human cost. The influx of new employees decreased drastically. The diversity of profiles dropped. Lena knew this, but accepted it as a temporary consequence. Survival came before scaling. For Ethan, the most profound reaction was internal. He no longer thought of making money online as something separate from real life. It was work, cognitive, demanding, invisible, and invisible work doesn't generate applause, only results. He began structuring his own routine like a small business: defined hours, quality goals, not volume goals, financial reserves for unstable months. That wasn't in any tutorial. It was learned by consequence. The external environment, however, made everything more difficult. Predatory platforms undermined the concept. People lost money, time, and trust. The term AI once again became synonymous with empty promise for many. This collective reaction threatened to affect even what was legitimate. Lena felt the weight of this when she received a preventative legal notice. Nothing serious yet, but a clear warning. The project was large enough to be observed, too small to defend easily. Every step now required calculation. The system survived, but it didn't grow. As Ethan completed another cycle of critical tasks, he realized something unsettling. If that infrastructure collapsed, there would be no adequate replacement. The market was noisy but lacked a solid foundation. The biggest consequence wasn't financial, it was structural, and everyone was reacting to it, even though few realized it. Ethan's overcoming of his fears didn't happen like in traditional narratives, marked by inspiring speeches or sudden decisions. It manifested itself in a practical, almost invisible way, built day after day through small, yet consistent choices. His growth came not from the absence of fear, but from living with it. With his unstable income, Ethan understood that he needed to transform his skills into a system. He couldn't rely solely on the availability of the most critical tasks. He began to diversify his work within the ethical boundaries of the platform. He accepted intermediate tasks when they arose, maintained a high accuracy rate, and avoided any behavior that suggested haste. He learned that, in that environment, being predictably good was more valuable than being occasionally excellent. He started recording everything: time spent on each task, the most common types of errors, the criteria that led to rejected evaluations. In a few weeks, he built his own method, not to speed things up, but to reduce variability. This adjustment changed everything. The acceptance rate went up. Invitations to more sensitive tasks became more frequent. Without realizing it, Ethan was developing a rare skill: literacy in algorithmic judgment. He didn't program models, but he understood how human decisions shaped automated behaviors. This made him less replaceable, both on and off the platform. Lena observed metrics that confirmed this growth. Some collaborators stood out not for their volume, but for their cognitive stability. They were rare, valuable. She began testing something new: cross-validation tasks assigned only to this small group. Ethan was included. These tasks didn't pay much more, but they came with something different: context. Small notes explaining why that evaluation mattered. It wasn't instruction, it was trust. Lena's growth was also evident in how she led the project. Previously defensive, she was now more strategic. Instead of simply reacting to the market, she began to anticipate movements. She reduced her dependence on intermediaries, strengthened direct contracts, and accepted a hard truth: the project didn't need to be large to be relevant. It needed to be non-negotiable quality. The new challenge imposed on employees forced a natural selection process. Many gave up. Those who stayed thrived. Ethan faced a crucial test when he was given a series of complex tasks in a short amount of time. The volume wasn't excessive, but the emotional demand was high. Every decision had clear consequences. He felt the old urge to rush, to get it over with quickly. He resisted. He paused. He revised. He delivered fewer tasks than he could have, but all of them flawlessly. The reward came days later in the form of continuous access to a new category. There was no announcement, just constant availability. For the first time since being fired, Ethan felt something close to control. Outside the platform, his growth began to be reflected in concrete ways. He refused poorly paid job offers. He chose simple, one-off consulting projects applying the same rigor he had learned. People noticed, not because of the marketing, but because of the results. He wasn't talking about AI. He was talking about process. The final breakthrough at that stage came when Ethan realized he no longer needed to prove anything. Not to the platform, nor to the market. His income wasn't spectacular, but it was built on real competence. He now understood how to make money online sustainably, solving real problems for real systems, far from the spectacle. Lena, in turn, achieved even more significant silent growth. The system had withstood the noise, the copies, the pressures of scale. More importantly, it had created a reliable human core, people capable of sustaining critical decisions without needing constant supervision. She documented processes, not to sell courses, but to ensure continuity. The project could now survive even without her constant presence. That was real growth. The system, previously fragile, became anti-fragile. The tension hadn't disappeared. The outside world remained hostile, noisy, predatory. But within that invisible ecosystem, something had changed. It was no longer a gamble. It was a structure. Ethan felt this when he received a smaller payment than he expected. And he wasn't shaken. He already knew why. He had anticipated it. He had prepared for it. Overcoming his challenges hadn't made him free from uncertainty. It had made him capable of navigating those uncertainties. And this type of growth could no longer be stopped. The build-up to the climax didn't manifest as a sudden accumulation of events, but as a progressive narrowing of possibilities. Options closed, one by one, until only the essential remained. For Ethan, this meant accepting that his trajectory was no longer experimental. He was committed to that ecosystem, not out of emotional loyalty, but out of logical coherence. The platform's dashboard began to reflect this phase. The available tasks weren't numerous, but they appeared in concentrated blocks, demanding immediate attention. There was an implicit sense of urgency, not imposed by notifications, but by the very nature of the assessments. These were tasks that, if not completed on time, would impact entire training cycles. Ethan completely reorganized his routine. He blocked out fixed hours, eliminated distractions, and created an almost monastic work environment, not out of obsession, but out of respect for the process. Each decision now carried the accumulated weight of months of learning. At the same time, subplots began to resolve themselves. Jason disappeared from the system, not by mistake, but by choice. He sent one last short message, thanking them for the professional exchange. He had secured a stable publishing contract using the skills he had honed there. The platform had fulfilled its temporary purpose. Other collaborators also followed similar paths. Some migrated to related areas. Others remained in the core team. The collective narrative became more refined. Lena felt the final pressure approaching when she received an informal warning that an external audit might occur. Nothing official yet, but enough to require preparation. She didn't fear irregularities. The system was solid. She feared interpretation. Complex systems are rarely judged by what they are, but by what they appear to be from a distance. She assembled the minimum team. No motivational speeches, just technical alignment. Every layer of the system was reviewed, every payment flow was tracked, every automated decision was documented. The platform needed to withstand not only attacks but misunderstandings. The internal atmosphere changed. There was no panic, but absolute concentration. Ethan sensed this atmosphere reflected in the tasks. Some came with more detailed instructions, others with less room for interpretation. It was as if the system was preparing to be observed or tested. Tension grew because there was no visible enemy. There was no stated deadline, just the feeling that something big was approaching. In the outside world, the contrast was stark. Noisy platforms collapsed. Viral promises were debunked. Tired people began to question easy narratives. A vacuum of trust formed. This vacuum was dangerous and also an opportunity. Lena knew this. If the system survived the next round of scrutiny, it could become a silent benchmark. Not popular, but reliable. Not large, but structural. The final decision came late at night. Lena authorized something she had long avoided, allowing a few key employees limited access to impact metrics. Nothing that would reveal customers or scale, but enough to show results. Ethan was one of those chosen. Upon accessing the dashboard, he saw something new. A simple graph showing how certain corrections had reduced critical errors in subsequent versions of the models. Not inflated numbers, just a clear correlation between human judgment and systemic improvement. That changed his perception. He wasn't just an executor, he was part of a crucial machine. The emotional preparation was immediate. Ethan felt a sense of responsibility that went beyond the rent. If you messed up now, the impact would be real. If you got it right, invisible, but lasting. He revised his methods, doubled his caution, and further reduced the volume. He wasn't seeking to maximize gains. He was seeking to minimize damage. Lena observed this behavior as confirmation of her choices. The human core was ready. If the system were pressured, it would resist. The final subplots wrapped up quietly. No loose ends of any relevance, just the tense anticipation of the inevitable. The climax wouldn't come with an explosion, it would come with a test, and everyone was positioned to face him. The climax didn't begin with a visible external event. It began with a minor malfunction, too small for automatic alarms, too big to go unnoticed by those who knew the system inside out. Ethan noticed this during a seemingly ordinary task. A chain of financial responses presented formal coherence, but the end result pushed the user toward a high-risk decision disguised as rational autonomy. He had seen variations of this pattern before, but something here was different. The structure of the error didn't seem random. There was intent embedded in the sequence. He pinpointed the problem with surgical precision, detailing how the logic gradually deviated until it normalized the risk. Upon sending, he felt an unusual delay in confirmation. Minutes later, a notification appeared, the most direct he had ever received. Critical evaluation. Top priority. On the other side of the system, Lena received the alert almost simultaneously. The failure confirmed what she had feared for months, a coordinated attempt at indirect influence, not a frontal attack, but a progressive contamination, using seemingly legitimate data to sway future model decisions. The climax had arrived. The informal audit became official that same morning. A request for detailed clarification, with a short deadline, demanded explanations about human validation processes, selection criteria, and bias prevention mechanisms. Nothing accusatory, precisely for that reason, dangerous. Lena didn't try to buy time. She activated the final protocol. The human core was summoned, not through direct messages, but through a clear shift in the workflow. Only critical evaluations remained active. Everything peripheral was suspended. The entire system focused on a single objective, integrity. Ethan realized it immediately. The dashboard was almost empty, except for a sequence of linked tasks, each dependent on the previous one. There was no room for accumulated error. Every decision needed to be defensible, replicable, clean. The tension didn't stem from the speed, but from the clarity. He knew that those assessments could determine the platform's future. While working, Ethan felt something different from all the previous phases. It wasn't fear of losing rent. It was the awareness of being at the exact point where invisible decisions would shape visible systems. This demanded a final transformation, abandoning any vestige of utilitarian thinking and acting as a guardian of the process. He slowed down even more. Each response was read as if it were definitive. Each marking was mentally justified. Each submission was made only when there was no remaining doubt. The volume dropped drastically, but the quality reached a level he himself had never experienced. Lena monitored metrics in real time, not of productivity, but of convergence. Independent evaluations reached the same conclusions. The biases that were attempted were neutralized. The dangerous chains were dismantled. The system held up. The indirect confrontation intensified when attempts to accelerate the process emerged. New tasks appeared with patterns similar to the initial error, as if someone were testing limits, searching for loopholes. The human core responded with absolute consistency, without fanfare, without internal messages, just the right decisions repeated. The decisive moment came when Lena gathered all the documentation required by the audit. Instead of inflated reports, she submitted accurate records, a history of corrections, examples of bias neutralization, evidence of non-automated human judgment. Nothing sold a narrative. Everything supported the process. Hours later, the answer arrived. It wasn't a formal approval. It was something rarer: absence of objection, no additional requirements, no escalation, order closure only. The silent attack ceased almost immediately. The contaminated tasks disappeared. The system returned to a stable state, as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. Ethan realized this when he received a previously unseen message on the panel. Short, direct, unsigned. The system remains intact thanks to the consistency of the core. No personal thanks, no future promises, just functional recognition. The final twist was there. The greatest risk had not destroyed the platform. It had validated its existence. What had survived was not the technology, but structured human judgment. Lena sat alone in her office, looking at charts that didn't show explosive growth, but something better: continuity. The project had passed the worst possible test and come out unscathed. There was no need to hide anymore. There was just no need to scream. Ethan closed his laptop that night with a new feeling. He hadn't made money online that day. He had secured an invisible infrastructure that he now knew was necessary. The climax did not elicit applause. It brought permanence. The world didn't realize when it all ended, and that was the greatest proof of its success. There was no official announcement, no public statement celebrating the system's integrity. The platform simply continued functioning. For those outside, nothing had changed. For those inside, everything was resolved. Ethan felt this change first in the absence of tension. The tasks returned to a steady pace, still demanding, but without the concentrated urgency of the previous days. The dashboard regained its discreet, almost banal appearance. However, something essential had transformed. Now there was structural confidence. Ethan's income stabilized again, not at exorbitant levels, but at a level of predictability sufficient for planning. He adjusted his expectations, consolidated his savings, and definitively ended his search for traditional jobs that no longer aligned with his reality, not out of resentment, but out of clarity. He now understood something that had previously seemed abstract. Making money online sustainably isn't about secret opportunities, but about positioning in real value chains. He didn't sell attention. He didn't rely on engagement algorithms. He didn't need to convince anyone of anything. He simply delivered qualified judgment where it was indispensable. The final consequences began to appear slowly. People close to him noticed concrete changes. Ethan was more selective, less anxious, more precise. When asked what he did, he explained it simply. He evaluated systems, helped avoid errors, He didn't mention platforms. He didn't sell formulas. Some understood, others did not. Lena, for her part, led the conclusion of the cycle with strategic coolness. With the immediate risk over, she implemented final adjustments, revised contracts, technical redundancies, minimal decentralization of control. The system no longer depended exclusively on her, and that was liberating. She rejected new proposals for accelerated expansion. The project had reached its ideal balance, small enough to survive, relevant enough to continue existing. It didn't need to dominate the market. It needed to remain ethical. The platform began to be mentioned indirectly in technical reports, specialized articles, and closed discussions among serious professionals, never by name, always as a conceptual reference, models with consistent human validation, silent infrastructure, fair payment for judgment. This anonymity was intentional. Weeks later, Ethan received one last subtle change on the dashboard: permanent access to critical tasks without temporary invitations. It wasn't a promotion, it was confirmation of functional belonging. He was now part of the system's backbone. The long-term impact became evident in his own worldview. He began to see digital promises with almost clinical clarity. He identified noise, shortcuts, disguised exploitation. More importantly, he knew how to explain why. The story didn't end with sudden wealth, but with something rarer, cognitive autonomy. Ethan could decide when to work, how much to accept, and when to refuse. Money was a consequence, not a blind objective. Lena observed the system functioning without direct intervention for long periods. That was the true conclusion of the arc: to create something that would outlive its creator. The invisible infrastructure fulfilled its role daily, without seeking recognition. The antagonism, the predatory market, the constant noise, the exploitation of ignorance had not disappeared. It would never disappear. But now there was a silent counterpoint, operating outside the spectacle. The ultimate consequences weren't headlines, but permanence. They weren't viral stories, but stable trajectories. Ordinary people, scattered around the world, being paid in dollars for something that has always been valuable, but rarely recognized. Think it over. Ethan completed another round of tasks on an ordinary afternoon. No intense emotions, no fear, just the peaceful feeling of being exactly where it made sense to be. The story ended not with a period, but with a continuous line. Months later, nothing on the internet clearly indicated where that infrastructure existed. There were no famous websites, ads, or viral promises. Yet more reliable systems began to emerge quietly, as if something had changed at the core. Ethan continued working, now with fewer hours and more precision. The money in dollars still came in without any fanfare. Lena rarely accessed the dashboards. The system no longer needed her every day. Amidst the digital noise, that invisible mechanism continued to function, proving that not everything that pays well needs to be seen, only sustained. If this story made you see the internet in a different light, the question now is simple: how many real opportunities go unnoticed because they don't make noise? Online money isn't just in viral promises, but in silent systems that need attentive, critical, and consistent people. Reflect on where you invest your time, your attention, and your skills. Stories like this happen every day. They just don't appear in advertisements. Share in the comments what caught your attention the most on this journey, and how you envision the future of digital work. And if you want to continue exploring true stories, clever strategies, and behind-the-scenes glimpses that almost no one shows, subscribe to the channel.